My name is Starsky Wilson. I'm pleased to welcome you to St. John's, the beloved community, here on the corner of Grand and Lee in St. Louis for a conversation. This is normally our Christian education time. For us, Jesus and justice go together. And so this will be a space of dialogue and conversation with some of our friends who have come to be with us this weekend about exactly that intersection in light of this anniversary. So I want to invite our panelists just to join me as we head up into the chancel, and they'll have opportunity to introduce themselves in their own way. You do have their bios in the bulletin that is listed before you. So joining us on today, one editorial note I will make is Patrice Cullors, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, was to be with us. Patrice was not feeling well to make the journey, and so she didn't come into Ferguson this weekend, but we do have another one of our friends here joining us in her place. And so really, for the sake of making sure there's enough and sufficient time for the voices of our friends, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves as a start of this conversation, and it will be exactly that. As it was themed in the invitation that you all received, this is about Jesus and justice and what Mike Brown still means. Some of you know the chant, and some of you said it out yesterday. Mike Brown means we've got to fight back. And so in light of our mission as church, and as people who are called by God, we want to have a conversation about what Mike Brown means to us here now, 365 days later. So I'll begin by asking our friends in conversation, as we have dialogue here, we'll open it up to you such that we don't, we enjoy one another and know one another, but we want you in on the conversation as well. There are microphones. Actually, I stole one of the microphones from out here, so I'm going to give this back to someone so that there'll be microphones on either end on these aisles, which is one of the reasons why we asked you to organize yourselves the way we did. The other reason was to be hospitable to folks who are coming later so they can just ease in and find a seat so that you're already consolidated. So thank you very much for your willingness to do that. So with that, I'm going to start on the other end and just ask our conversation leaders to introduce themselves in whatever way they would like to all of you. Again, you have their bios in the bulletin, but they may have other things to say about themselves. So we'll start on the end with our friend Lisa Sharon Harper.
Hello, everyone. It's really an honor to be here, and honestly, I'm already impressed with this congregation and with this weekend. I don't know how many of you are from St. Louis, but who have flown in like myself from Washington, D.C., but I've been struck by the spirit here. I was here a year ago, and I work with sojourners in Washington, D.C., and I'm a writer and an activist with them. My job is Chief Church Engagement Officer, which basically means my job is to help get the church out of the pews and into the streets around the country, and for various issues, but my central focus really is on racial justice. But the thing, I was talking with Reverend Wilson earlier today, the thing that has really blown my mind over the course of the 2-3 days we've been together has been the level of organization that exists here now is just black and white from a year ago. And it's testament to the work, the hard work of many of the people in this room, and also the work of God, I think, across the country to catalyze a new civil rights movement as a result of what happened here 1 year ago today.
Thank you, Lisa. Mm-hmm. Alice.
Good morning. My name is Alice Hunt, and I'm president of Chicago Theological Seminary. I'm really thankful for St. John's, for you, Reverend Wilson, and what you're doing to be a sanctuary and a safe space for people. I grew up Southern Baptist. I'm ordained National Baptist. Now I'm United Church of Christ, and I'm telling you that because I think that matters with the work that we're doing today. And I'm here because I recognize that I have privilege and that I have a responsibility to do something with that privilege and to work with as an ally and supporter for this movement that is what we've been waiting for and what we've been needing.
Reverend Osagyefo Sekou. I went to Sudan, graduated in 1989. So I'm a tiger. As we say, I'm from here. I know this place well. I married my first wife down the street. My first one. Pray for me. And I've been blessed to run around the country and around the world and gain a certain set of skills. I'm now the Bayard Rustin Fellow with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Our national organizing director, Ethan Vesley Fladd, is here. I've been blessed, in addition to training, we trained about close to 1,000 here in nonviolent civil disobedience, and we've trained about 4,000 around the country in nonviolent civil disobedience. I tend to get arrested. And it's just good to be home. I moved back home a few months ago, having spent the majority of the last year here, to come home and bring back some gifts that they might be brought to bear on our struggle here.
Thank you all very much. I'll enter in a little bit, but mostly I'm here to facilitate. So I'm pastor here, and I'm really excited about that because they're really cool people here. I hope you've met some. I want to say a little bit about the space over the course of the last year, because I think the space has been transformed by these kind of voices and presence in the space. So a couple of significant things that have happened in this space based upon the hospitality of the beloved disciples here. This space, almost a year ago, on August 31st, became the host space for 4 days for the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride, which is one of the reasons why it was so appropriate to have our friend Patrice to be here with us on today. And in many ways, the space where you are, quite frankly, on that Saturday morning before they went out into actions, was transformed by 450 people who came in from 20 different states across the country to be a part of this movement and to spread it in unique ways. St.Johns also served as the welcome center for Ferguson October for people who came in from out of town, were looking for housing placements, were getting connected to people. They checked in here, and we received them with hospitality here. We housed some folks here, and there are a couple of beloved disciples who are housing folks from Atlanta this weekend as well. This is a place that we don't believe is our own. It's God's space and should always be open to all people. And so this is how we've sought to engage in this work, not only with beloved disciples here, organizing and acting together, connected through text networks and all of that to make sure nobody's alone at an action, but then also seeking to open a space to offer it to the movement for however the movement needed it to be used. That's part of what we believe to be our stewardship responsibility in this space and place. So I say all that to say this is your space. And so we invite you to be a part. When we talk about the events of August 9th, we all have, it's one of those times that we can remember where we were, when we found out what that experience was like. And so I want to, as we enter in and open this up a little bit, is ask our conversation partners and leaders here, where were you when you came to know that there was something going on here in Ferguson? If you could just kind of describe that moment or that series of moments and how it evolved on your consciousness.
For me, it's really fresh. I had just come off of a retreat, a 3-day retreat, with a group called Evangelicals for Justice, which formed about 6 years ago. And the whole purpose of that group, which is a group of seminary professors and writers and conference directors and just major national leaders within the evangelical world who are committed to justice, their whole purpose is to be salt and light within the evangelical world, kind of transforming their understanding of the gospel to be in line with what we believe is Jesus' understanding of the gospel. More Jesus and justice. Hello, somebody. But we had just come off of 3 days of conversation about race and about race in the evangelical world and how we need to deal with that. And then literally on that Saturday I got home and I saw the news that night. And I just remember immediately thinking something is not right here. Especially when I think immediately they had the interview with Dorian Johnson, who had one story, and the very next morning there was another report by the chief of police here in St. Louis, who gave a completely different story, as if it was fact, as if they had done an investigation and this is what it is. And then it came out that there's no police report at all. So, I mean, honestly, at that point, it was like, something's wrong. And then the tanks started rolling out about a week later, you know, and the protesters are getting tear gassed. And I did not sleep for a week. I mean, literally, because we felt like we were in a surreal universe, like an alternate universe where things that should be just are not. And the truth is called a lie, and the lies are called truth. And it just felt like, whoa. So something in me just knew I had to come, but I had no idea why what was the need. And it became clear when I realized that for us at Sojourners, I mean, Sojourners is not going to be like the people who lead Ferguson into health. I mean, Sojourners is a mostly white organization, let's face it, right? But what we do have as our vocation is bridge building. And so we realized that the people who were marching were not really representative of the demographics of the surrounding area. Particularly, there weren't a lot of white folks out there. There were some, and there were some even really awesome, faithful white pastors, but their congregations weren't coming. So my purpose in coming in and Sojourners sending me was to begin to organize those churches, particularly evangelical ones, to engage. And it started this thing called Faith for Justice here in St. Louis.
Good deal. Reverend Sekou.
I'm a scholar in residence at Stanford at the Martin Luther King Papers, and so I had to spend about 6 weeks there working on a book called Martin Luther King Remixed. So I was trying to apply Martin Luther King to this particular moment. And I was sitting in the archives reading mostly of his mistakes. What did he do wrong, right? And then actually Keeler McDuff, who's our media advisor, was in California at the time working for Greenpeace, and texted me and said, they've killed someone in your hometown, and you should go home. And I responded, you know, well, happens all the time, you know, ain't nobody gonna do nothing. I'm from St. Louis. So I was like, so they ain't gonna do nothing. They ain't gonna do nothing in St. Louis. So she kept saying, you probably should try to get home. And then about Sunday, it got a little hot, and Bishop John Selders, who's here, and is also from St. Louis, and we started calling each other, and he said, in St. Louis, in 80 St. Louis parlance, we were like, have you seen what's happening at the crib? I said, yeah. I said, they done turned up at the crib. And I said, but they ain't gonna do nothing. They ain't gonna stay in the street. It's St. Louis. They gonna stay in the tree. So by Wednesday, I called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I said, I need to go to the crib because they done turned up. I'd been in the archives, you know, looking at the archival footage of particularly Watts and all the mistakes that King made. And one intervention is when King gets to LA after the Watts riots, the first thing he does is an interview at the airport. So this is 1965. So if Martin Luther King's on TV in 1965, everybody's watching. And so he does what we do, right? There's a certain game for those of us who have to spend a lot of time on TV in terms of narrative. So, you know, try not to scare white folks. So you play the game, right? You redirect. And so he's doing what he's supposed to do as a person who's on TV. But he does that interview with basically appeasing the white establishment, and then the next meeting's in the hood. And so by the time he gets to the hood, the people that saw him playing the game on the TV. So, by the time he hits Watts, they on fire. So as soon as he walk in, they like, get out of here, Martin Luther King. Because he been buck dancing on TV, because that's part of the role that some of us have to play, right? So one of the first things I didn't do is when I landed, the media started calling me, and I wouldn't do interviews, right? First, I was like, who the leadership? I called Jamala Rogers, mama, is it okay if I go on TV? I found Tef and Tori. Look, y'all been in the streets. Can I go on TV? What do I need to do? Because I wasn't gonna do what Dr. King did, right? Transport in, and even though I'm from here, seeming like an outsider. Does that make sense to you? And so one of the things that for me is that when I flew from Stanford here, it's like I got on a plane and I flew back in time.
Yes.
Right. So when we hit the streets that night, and it's tanks and tear gas and dogs, it was immediately. And so if there be a God, right, the time that I was able to spend studying King's life and legacy prepared me. Not that I made plenty of mistakes, right? And the young folks quick to point them out and remind me of Rev, you remember when you did that? But so for me, there was something kind of providential about spending this time studying King's work and then being able to come home. Yeah. Now.
That's great. So part of this learning that Sekou was talking about that he experienced, church leadership writ large, or at least anybody who's paying attention has experienced. And I was asked a question yesterday I was not effectively equipped to answer by someone who's dealing with seminary curriculum. So I'm going to pass it to you, Alice.
Great.
So this particular professor from Garrett Evangelical Seminary was talking about, actually raised the question on the panel with elected officials and appointed ones from St. Louis about, I believe the terminology he used was domesticated Negro preachers. His term, not mine. I'm just. Yeah, certain theological sophistication there. And what he asked about was he suggested to the elected officials who were there that they had to work with in the community a set of and a large cohort of domesticated Negro preachers. And he asked, what must be done and what can the seminary do? How can we prepare better, more ready ministers for the kind of work and the kind of learnings that Reverend Sekou has laid out, right? So he's been on an agenda. He's written a curriculum for himself, and he's teaching it this summer, as a matter of fact. But as you think about how ministers are prepared for the church and for the community, what are some of the things you have seen or have heard or have discerned in your role at CTS about how we've got to change how we prepare leadership of the church to align and to engage in a movement like this?
Thank you. So you tell me if I'm right about this or not. But
Sekou will tell you if you're right.
The curricula that we're teaching in seminaries today is the curricula that was developed for white tall steeple churches of the 70s.
Oh yeah, I tell you, you're right about that.
And it's not connecting with the streets. So there's something about thinking that you can give people theoretical learning in history and theology and Bible and ethics and pastoral care, and they're going to turn into leaders. There's a disconnect there. So we have to be about leadership development, and that can be learned, but not by reading books. It's about who you are as a being. That's how we see it in the leaders of the movement in Ferguson. It's who they be.
Yeah.
And so how do we prepare religious leaders to meet the needs of the world? What has to be in the curriculum so that they're prepared to do that? What ought we to be teaching in seminaries? And it's what Reverend Tracy Blackman said yesterday, which is it's not the theology of the books, it's the theology of the streets. So how do we connect the really interesting learning that we do in seminary with the lived lives of people? How can religious leaders that are being trained in seminary support the movement as opposed to the movement supporting the religious leaders?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, I'm really blessed this week, Reverend Renita Lamp, y'all know Reverend Renita? Yeah. Right. She got more street cred than any preacher in this town. Yeah. Let's be clear about that. And we're co-teaching a course on theology and Black Life Matters at Eaton Theological Seminary this week. And it's been such a blessing. But I think one of the challenges for us in terms of Christian ministry and Christian discourse is actually at the Christological level. So I think it's a Christological intervention. So one of the orthodoxies of Christianity that has never been disputed in 2,000 years is that Jesus was God. Right? There was never a debate. I mean, there was some debate, they lost. Right, but that Jesus was God. So one way I think that is oriented into the text, and I'm a student of the great James Cone, and been blessed to spend many days with Dr. West and others who are wrestling with some of these questions, is that if the Christological intervention, right, because this plays not only the seminary, but it's also in the sanctuary, what's coming out in pulpits, right? So the Christological intervention for me is that if the Christian orthodoxy for 2,000 years, there's never been a debate that God became flesh. So God makes a choice predicated again on the ancient notions of omniscience, of being all-knowing. So God became flesh in the body. God chooses to become flesh in the body of an unwed teenage mother among an unimportant people in an unimportant part of the world living under occupation. This is God's choice. And one of the rumors that I believe is, and the historians can correct me, I believe it's in either Josephus's writings or one of the ancient rabbis, maybe in Justus, talks about that it was rumored that Jesus was the product of rape, right? That a Roman centurion had raped his mother, and that's how she became pregnant. So if God chooses to be born into the world, if God is all-knowing, chooses to be born into the world in the body of an unwed teenage mother among an unimportant people in an unimportant part of the world, living under occupation, right? Product of rape, according to rumor that's on him, and he's a handyman. Carpenter is not the right translation. It's he who works with his hands. So he don't have a union. Right, he's a handyman. You know him, the guy who come by and say, give me $2 or $3 and I'll sweep these leaves. I'll get, you know, he work on a little electricity and all the lights on the left side of the house be off when you get done. So your Savior was born to a teenage mother among an unimportant people in an unimportant part of the world, living under occupation. The product of rape is a handyman. So with that theological orientation, when you hit the streets of Ferguson, it looks a little different. So those kids with the tattoos on there. So for me in the streets of Ferguson, I can tell you that, you know, we sing these songs about the day we got saved. It was one Friday evening. I was in the streets of Ferguson, and I saw some queer women, 20-year-olds, facing tanks and tear gas. And I got born again. Right? And that, so for me, that I actually think that there is something in the historical Christian narrative that we can pull upon that is one of the challenges around a Christological intervention, that it begins with the orthodoxy of Christianity, which might be a way for us to move forward, right? So that means that means we can read the space in such a way that Michael Brown's blood takes on a certain holiness. Right, because he fits the profile of the one that we sing about every Sunday. Right? So for me, that's one way to kind of come at it theologically and refuse to center. I refuse to give the center to the right wing on Christological discourse. Right. So it serves two methodological as well as kind of theological intervention.
I think that the thing that has really struck me, and I think that there's another whole, from the same coin, on the other side of that coin, The theological intervention in the evangelical world over the last year has been the question of who is human. It's actually an ontological question. It's a question of who bears the image of God and what are the implications of that. Because I think, here's the thing. In the organizing world, we know that passage really well. We are all made in the image of God. We are always talking about that. They're made in the image of God, and so we need to, and so honestly, it's almost like water off a duck's back now to say that, because it barely even registers. Yeah, of course we're made in the image of God. We're all made in the, but what does that mean? What does that mean? And I think for me, something clicked in the last year, and I wrote 2 pieces to reflect on my time in here in August a year ago. And one was called The Lie, and the other one was called The Other Lie. And the first lie was the lie that, now, where to start? It starts with Plato. Plato was one of the first philosophers that actually began to break down race. But he didn't have it in color. He actually believed in the golden race, the silver race, the iron race, right? Like he believed certain people were made of certain metals, and so therefore they were created to be in certain stations of society. Created to be in certain stations of society. That was then translated by Linnaeus, who was a botanist, who took the taxonomy of fauna and then translated over to humans and said, okay, now there's a taxonomy of human value, and he put white people at the top and pygmies at the bottom. And then that was translated into American law in the 1660s, and I think it was 1662 or something around there, where you had a court case where for the very first time you had a black man who was arrested and charged and went through the courts with 2 other white men who were all indentured servants. And when they got through with that trial, it was the 2 white men who were released from servitude, but that black man was then put back into servitude in perpetuity because of his color, nothing more. And then after that, next thing you know, you have written into law in Virginia the changing of, they moved to partus, which is your status is by your mother, not your father, because the white men were raping the women. And if they had a white father, then they could actually claim by English law that they could be freed, because that's how it worked in England. So they changed that law, right? So, and then in 1787, you have the 3/5 Compromise, where black people on the bottom of that chain are called less than human. And then 3 years later, in 1790, you have the Naturalization Act of 1790. The Naturalization Act of 1790 declared, and this is where we get to the image of God, declared that only white men of good character could become naturalized citizens of the United States. Now, why is that so important? Why is it important to become a naturalized citizen of the United States? It's important because as a citizen, you can vote. You can exercise dominion. So that was a declaration that the only people who were called to exercise dominion on this land are white men. Now, what's the lie? Because if we are all human in Genesis 1, and in the same breath that God says, and let us make humankind in our image, in the same breath God says, and let them exercise dominion, then that means that anyone who is human is also called and created with the capacity to exercise dominion. But we put a lie into law. And then we lived according to that law for 200 years. And then we lived it, we had the Amendment 13th, 14th, and then we had Jim Crow. And then we had mass incarceration. And then we had, stand your ground. And concealed carry. And Trayvon Martin. and Michael Brown. Do you see what I'm saying? So the question that Mike Brown, this is what Mike Brown still means to me. And it means it theologically as a result of what happened last year, is Mike Brown called into question who is human. Who has the capacity to exercise dominion? And then the DOJ report revealed that those who had the capacity to exercise dominion in Ferguson and in many Fergusons are still white men.
Just want to try to run a through line. This is, I said it was the Christian education time, right? We got Christology, we got ontology, theological anthropology. It's all running through here. And the implications are for ecclesiology, and particularly ecclesiastical standing. So we just had a conversation in 3 moves about who gets authorized based upon who Christ is, who we are, who gets to exercise dominion, and we make decisions about that on who gets to be leadership in the life of the church. That all threads together.
Go ahead and preach. Fix it, Doc. Fix it.
So I want to invite you to preach. Because, as if he's not already preaching, right? So neither of us are attorneys, so we don't have that, this is private, confidential stuff at the bottom of our emails.
Yes.
So later today, quick commercial and shameless plug. Tonight at 7:30 p.m. at the Movement Church, Greater St. Mark, there will be a conversation about the Black church, where Reverend Sekou will introduce one of our esteemed guests for this morning, Dr. Cornell West.
Yes.
So you want to be there, and you probably want to be there early. You look at the number of people here, and then you think about 7:30, they're going to have a chance to go to church, have some food, take a nap. They're going to be there early. So that's what I'm going to do. So you want to be there early. A part of that conversation we'll also have as a conversation partner on the panel, Sister Bree Newsom. I was talking to somebody yesterday about that. They said, I would have gotten some wire, like climbing up to get it. I would try to bring it down to me, but not Sister Bree. So I'm gonna let you in on the email conversation. So we had an email exchange about the definition of church leadership and authorized standing in the church as a leader, quote unquote clergy, based upon preparation versus faithful acts of witness. In the center of that conversation was Sister Bree Newsom. And it challenged and moved at the boundaries a little bit. And you led us there, Reverend Sekou. So I want you to kind of get at that, what it means to engage in faithful clergy leadership, and maybe some new definitions we need to consider in moments like this.
Well, I'm thinking about that wonderful scene in Beloved where baby Suggs is out in that field, and she said, "Love your hands, and love your flesh," right? That whole time. Which one is the queerest moment in the text? Secondly, what happens is that when Toni Morrison early in the novel describes her as unrobed, unordained, and uncalled, and then says, but AME, Baptist, non-believer alike, came to hear her preach week after week. Once a year she would do a sermon around harvest time. In my mind, baby Suggs, she Kojic, right? She's saved and sanctified like I am, right? And so for me it breaks open the meaning of who is authorized to do church. And I said this to Bree yesterday. She preached the most important sermon on Black Life Mattering since the death of Michael Brown by climbing that pole. It's the most important sermon. And I done preached some good ones since then. But the most important sermon, because what happens is that it's much of what in theology that comes out of the Old Testament tradition is a theophany. It's like a burning bush, right? It's about when God appears in the physical manifestation in which theology and praxis and practice meet each other to develop a praxis that sets something on fire. So I think that's one. The other piece is that I recently resigned from my pulpit in Boston, and I had a great congregation. They supported us. My minister music came and was arrested with us. Black Lives Matters met regularly in our congregation. Extremely liberal church. I have a 15-year-old drag queen performing in the middle of my services. I mean, they let me get away with murder around that place. So it wasn't a bad move. I didn't leave on. But I want to try to take some time to look at what I'm calling the sanctuary of the street and the communion of protests. Because I believe something happens when we're in the street. Durkheim's notion of collective effervescence, right? So when we in the street chanting, you can feel it. Something happens to us, and the faith claim of this movement, right? Because it has faith claims, is I believe we will win, which is often led by a queer black woman, right, who is the priest in that context, right? And so something is happening theologically, and something moves, and there's a very powerful spirit that takes place in that. And the truth be told, the clergy was on the wrong side the vast majority of this time. So, I mean, there's some romanticism and some revisionist history that's going on, but let's be clear, they were on the wrong side. There are about 1,000 churches in the greater St. Louis area. We begged churches when they were tear gassing our babies. Open your doors, please. 2 in the whole damn, I'm sorry, stop. 2 in the whole town open their doors to these babies. The holiest place in terms of our movement, besides Greater St. Mark's, the holiest place is a coffee house run by a white lesbian. Mokabees. That's the holiest place here. It's our Mount Sinai, our Mecca, right? Every time you go there, every activist in the country is coming through there. It's been tear gassed twice, right? So part of it is that there's a redefinition of me who is authorized to carry the gospel. But I think, again, I don't want to surrender the text. I'm not giving the right wing the text. In Mark, and at the end of Mark, who's the first to proclaim that Jesus is risen? The unauthorized. The sisters. Right? It's the sisters, the unauthorized. The gospel begins by those who are not authorized to who are not authorized to engage in Christian in religious leadership. That's where the gospel begins. Wasn't no rabbis. The disciples, the men, they hiding. They scared. But some faithful sisters. And that's what we consistently saw in the streets of Ferguson. Women, young, 20-something, queer. You don't know if they're a boy or a girl. You don't understand who they are. They profane. And I just want to say, if you're more concerned about young people saying, well, if you're more concerned, I'm trying to act like I know. So if you're more concerned about young people using profanity than the profane conditions that they live in, something wrong with you. And so I think in terms of the discourse is that, and this is the last note on it, we just did a gathering, the Movement for Black Lives. Some of the folks who were there, Movement for Black Lives in Cleveland, right? 1,500 activists, most of them who have been in the street around the country. Many of them inspired by Ferguson. They've been tear gassed everywhere, right? It was interesting, both at the opening and closing ceremony. I think it was the first time in the history of black people, particularly in modernity in the United States, it was the first time that the black church was not center. There's been a shift but they're deeply spiritual. They're deeply concerned about care, self-care, ritual. They're doing theological practice. And so I think part of it is that what is the theological lens that we develop? So what I'm attempting to do is read the street in theological terms, right, as a way to make the translation, right? And so if Black Lives Matters is the word, then Ferguson is the word made flesh, right? That what we see embodied, something started by queer Black women, and then in the streets of Ferguson, we see queer Black women embodying it on the street. So they become the word made flesh. And so I think that opens up the way. If it was left up to me, right, and I'm Pentecostal, I can do it. I'd ordain all of them. Every last Diamond, Alexis, Brittany, Ashley, Tef, Tori, right? T-Dub, right? Low key, I'd ordain every last one of them because I'd take them over most preachers in the town. So we need to break open the meaning of church, break open the meaning of that. And I think of one way we can do this, I'm keep leaning over to you because this is what I want you to do at CTS. Is the other piece is that I think one way churches can respond to this moment in a very simple way denominationally is that all communions agree on two sacraments, baptism and communion, right? You may have other stuff you can get ordained to do, but that's what we all agree on, right? I think the third table needs to be the table of the poor. That should be an ordainable call. So young people coming through seminary, they don't want to go to a church, but they want to run a soup kitchen. That's holy work. Ordain them. That's one way we can respond to the way in this kind of paucity of the way in which the church defines itself.
Good. Alice, I know you've been dreaming about this in your work at CTS, so I want to give you an opportunity to kind of weigh into this conversation a little bit too.
I agree with what you said. We need to quit trying to preserve the church that has gone by and be the church that needs to be now. What I feel a responsibility to say, though, is that there are some white folks in here, like me, and we have a particular job to do in our own communities. I think about David, the story of David, and he came from nothing. And all of a sudden, he had power and he had privilege. Power by itself is not bad, but power with privilege, something happens. And something happened to David. And David started doing some pretty awful things out of his privilege. And then so have you seen the thing about the study they did with the game of Monopoly at the University of California? They took two people and did it again, repeated it again and again, gave one person lots of money, the other person a little bit. The rich person got to roll 2 dice. The poor person got to roll 1. The rich person got to move double whatever they rolled. And when it first started, they would be looking at each other like, what's going on? And pretty soon the rich person was piling up dollars, Monopoly dollars. And all of a sudden the rich person would start doing, yeah! And then the rhetoric of the rich person started being how they earned it and how they deserved it, ignoring the random factor of what had happened. This was repeatable. Privilege does something to us. And 1 Samuel 12, you've got Nathan telling David about the abuse of power and privilege. And David's like, oh, tell me who that is. I'm going to kill that person. Oh, that's ridiculous. I'm the king. I'm going to fix this. Who is it? Don't be afraid, Nathan. Tell me who it is. Thou art the man. So, my white friends, I have a job to do, and you do, that only we can do, and we need to be about it. That's what I think we need to be doing at CTS.
So I want to break open this conversation, and I invite you all into it. There are microphones on either side here in the front, but I wanted to offer first shot. I almost said privilege, but I want to. I want to offer first shot at comment or question or reflection to our esteemed guests, Sister Bree or Dr. West, if they wanted to share. We'll also give them opportunity at the close just to share whatever reflections. But if they had questions there, they wanted to agitate in this conversation, then I want to give them the opportunities first.
Well, since the spotlight's on me, this is just something that I have pondered a lot because, I think about Jesus Christ talking about you can't serve two masters. And I think it's interesting that in that context, he was talking specifically about money. And so I'm wondering, again, you just brought up the thing about monopoly and how much the whole thing of privilege is tied often to economics, to money, to, the whole slave system, right, was about the value of money and property and building being so great that was held up as an idol over human life. And so I'm wondering, do you feel, can the church endorse capitalism? That's my question.
That's a great question. Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. I'm in the middle of writing my fourth book now, thank you very much, called The Very Good Gospel. And it is a reflection on the gospel through the lens of shalom, of the biblical concept of shalom. And each chapter breaks down one of the relationships that was broken at the fall. And the chapter I just finished was the shalom between nations and God's governance. And at the heart of God's governance, one of the things that struck me was that when God actually did establish God's government in the nation of Israel, when the Ten Commandments were created and all the ordinances and statutes that came after it, that I see three major economic pillars to God's governance that we can learn from. And they are not capitalist. But but here's the thing. I think that we have a certain kind of capitalism at work in America and in the world now called free market capitalism, laissez-faire free market capitalism, which is particularly evil. But what you see in God's governance is you see the Sabbath, the sabbatical year, and the year of Jubilee, all of which are equalizing factors to varying degrees. The Sabbath, which I thought was so profound, is one time per week. If somebody was a slave the other 6 days a week, on God's day, there would be equality before God's throne. On God's day, they would all be equally welcome before the throne and equally worthy and have a right to rest. On the sabbatical year, every 7 years, you had the forgiving of debts, and you had slaves being set free. If they had worked for 6 years, they were set free on that 7th year. And then on the year of Jubilee, multiply that every 7 times 7 years, 49 years, 50 years. Then you would have homes, land that was lost in the midst of debt, be given back to the original deed holders who entered the land. And when God said, oh, that portion of land is for that family, and that, so that in God's economy, you never had a family fall into poverty in perpetuity. There was always a reset button. Always an opportunity for a reset button, because God knows, and this again goes back to that image of God piece, God knows that the quickest way to crush the image of God on earth is through poverty and oppression. Now the thing about capitalism, especially the way that we practice it, is that capitalism depends on the crushing of the image of God in some. Capitalism, you can't have a thriving, laissez-faire, free market capitalist society without a bustling underclass. without a large underclass. And that's part of the reason why when we threw the doors open in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan and also Margaret Thatcher, and they did a whole worldwide thing, when we threw those doors open, that's when the deep inequity in our society began to grow. And now we have the most inequitable society on planet Earth right now, right here. So can we have a capitalist society, or can we be capitalist and Christian? I would say we definitely cannot be laissez-faire free market capitalists. There are about 20 different forms of capitalism, though. In fact, there's even socialist capitalism. So there is, I think, a possibility of having a market and actually allowing people to, in the way that Adam Smith actually wanted the market to run, which was to serve each other in community. But we have to be grounded in community. And we also have to bring God back into our understanding of what the market is supposed to do.
One of my pastors, Pastor Michael Walren at First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, challenged us to nuance Black Lives Matter. He said, Black lives have always mattered. Black lives have mattered because how many black lives you had and owned gave you wealth and status. So black lives have always mattered. It's how black lives matter. In Hosea, Hosea is an awful book in the Bible. I mean, really, it's terrible. But Hosea 4:1-3, God has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land because there's lying and cheating and faithlessness with each other. And because there's lying and cheating and faithlessness with each other, the whole world, all of humanity, the animals, the birds, the fish, all perish. Why? Because we're interdependent. And until we recognize our total interdependence, which I think flies into the face of capitalism, we can't be who God calls us to be.
Well, there's a rich socialist tradition. I'm a socialist, and unabashedly about that. So I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, which makes me a bourgeois socialist. But I'm a socialist nonetheless, right? And that part of the socialist tradition that it emerges out of African American tradition is grounded in Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a socialist, right? He says in 1951, he writes a series of love letters, which I wish I'd never read, but a series of love letters between him and Coretta Scott King, where he says to her, she has given him Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards. It's a socialist utopian novel. And so she gave it to him as a gift, and there's a couple love letters between them about that. And he says to her, my thinking is more socialistic than it is capitalistic. When Martin Luther King meets with C.L.R. James in London, coming back from Nkrumah's inauguration in 1960, C.L.R. James says in his papers that it was clear that Dr. King agreed with us for the most part on socialist ideas, but we would not hear it from his pulpit, right? Because two things constrained Martin Luther King: the church and the Red Scare. So he's constrained, but he was a democratic socialist all the time. Right? And so later in life, after Watts, he begins to shift more publicly and articulate his socialist leanings, right? So that's Martin Luther King, a socialist, okay? There's a tradition of black socialism that goes back for as far as George Washington Woodbey, pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in San Diego, California, who ran on the ticket with Eugene Debs, the vice presidential ticket, as a socialist candidate. Right, so there's a radical tradition of black Christian socialists, and there's a book by George Washington Woodbey where he's in conversation with his mother about Jesus and justice, and his grandma and his mama doesn't give up Jesus, but she embraces socialism because it is compatible with the gospel. Now, it's not to say that socialist governments have been fair, just. They've done damage to the economy. Anybody, one of my fights with Fidel is like, I don't understand why you outlawed jazz music and James Brown. Right, so there's some challenges, right, some challenges with Mao Zedong, right, some challenges, right, to say the least, but there is a part of a rich Christian socialist tradition in terms of those of us who understand the gospel being fundamentally compatible with democratic checks on the market, right? Which includes the dismantling of publicly traded corporations because they're undemocratic institutions predicated on privilege, which the Latin word is private law, which is enshrining these things that we've already described, right? So there's a tradition of that I'm a part of. Secondly, one of the challenges, since y'all up here, y'all quoting the Bible, so, you know what I'm saying, I went to Union. You get through the whole thing and not have to read the Bible. In seriousness, is that Jesus in the temple, you've turned the temple of robber, and you turned the house of prayer into a temple of robber and thieves. That part of not only is the church, not only is the church making kind of theological room for capitalism, it has become a capitalist space in and of itself, right? So pastors are CEOs, right? The churches are stadiums, right? So I'm the pastor and CEO of this. They become multinational corporations, one church, several locations. And then we begin to respond with the discourse, with capitalist discourse in Christian drag. Favor ain't fair. Market discourse, blessings, when praises go up, blessings come down. That's market discourse. See, my Bible got the book of Job in it. Yeah. Right? The people I come from, right? My grandmother and them, they were poor people, but they had dignity. And they say, yet though he slay me, yet will I praise him, right? Yet will I trust him, right? And so part of it is that the way in which capitalist discourse has become normalized, then you add that upon the way in which neoliberalism has come to dominate the nonprofit industrial complex. Churches begin to reproduce that through their CDCs, right? They reproduce it in such a way in which they begin to engage in activities as union busting. And so part of it is that the way, not only is capitalism a problem, it has saturated the church. That it becomes normative, right? So we begin to think about success in a capitalist model. How many members you got? How many services do you have, right? And so, right, how many coming into your doc, right? But not a discourse about faithfulness, which is a non-market value, right? Faithfulness is a non-market, because you can be faithful, and Martin Luther King was not successful. His approval rating, but when he dies, is 38. Is it 38%, Doc?
72 disapproval rate for whites, 55% disapproval rate for Negroes.
So 55% of black folk don't like him when he get killed.
Wow.
Right? So he ain't successful. Malcolm is not successful. Right? But when we talk about a language of faithfulness, that's non-market discourse, right? And so what that means is that then when we begin to read it through that line and under that tradition of this there's a black socialist Christian tradition that we can begin to embrace and understand the ways in which the market functions as a structure of evil. And so there are four staples that have come out of indigenous socialist traditions in America, right? Guaranteed income, that's Martin Luther King. Everybody has a right to an income. CEOs got it. Universal health care, not the market-driven stuff that we got with Obamacare, right? So universal health care, universal education for everybody, K through 12, as well as continuing education, right? Right, and everybody should have access to a house. These are four staples that come out of black socialist tradition, which seems like those four things the church could embrace.
Can I just add one thing here, just real quick? So one other piece to that discourse, on the, another facet of it, and the ways that the market language has infiltrated our talk. So when we talk about government, we talk about it as a business often. And especially around this time, when you get into election season, and you got Trump, #1, hello, in the Republican Party right now. I mean, part of the reason for that is because there's a section, a large portion of the country that is really asking the question of, is it the best business leader who can run the country? But the problem is that when you think of our nation, our government as a business, that's when you start actually asking the questions of, well, what do you have to cut? Who do you have to cut? Who do you have to cut? And you start thinking about the business of governing as a business of growth. a business of growth and prosperity, and basically you want to see more dollars on the table and efficiency and things like that. But governance is not about growth. Governance is about the protection, the serving, and the cultivating of the image of God within your borders. That's what governance is supposed to do. Now, socialism, as much as it's able to do that, yes. Capitalism, as much as it's able to do that, yes, but not beyond that. Whenever any governing structure begins to crush, twist, or mangle the image of God, it then is against God.
There's one right there, Doc.
Brother Wilson, for your magnificent ministry. And it's just a blessing to be in this space. Reverend Wilson, Brother Starsky Wilson, and this very rich discussion. I'm so glad that Sister Bree raised the question of capitalism, the market-driven culture in which we find ourselves. Because for me, as a Christian, or at least someone who's in the perennial process of trying to become a Christian, because I fall every day, but I bounce back, it raises the issue of idolatry. You see, that when you look at the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, which is a moment in the longer Black freedom struggle, you see, the Black freedom struggle has always historically had spiritual resources that could target idolatry, because the freedom struggle was predicated on the centrality of history and the gravity of calling a vocation. Now, in a market-driven culture, it undermines history, so the young folk, many of us as well, no longer have historical memory. So all we have is the present. And in a market-driven society, the present is just a repetition of instant gratification over and over and over again, and the idols of money, the idols of status. And white supremacy is a particular form of satanic and demonic spirituality. That if you don't have an armor, it gets inside of you. And it doesn't only have to do with vanilla, brothers and sisters. Right. White supremacy shot through the souls of black people. You see.
That's right.
You don't have to have white brothers and sisters around for white supremacy to operate.
That is exactly.
Because it's been operating for 400 years on black folk. Yeah. Trying to keep black folk scared, fearful, intimidated. My question is that given the fact that the historical memory more and more is being pushed back, and given the fact that this sense of a calling is being trumped in the name of the market. So it's just career, professionalism, getting over, upward mobility, status, money, position. That's true for the church, it's true for the seminary, true for the academy, true for the government. It's true for every nook and cranny. It's true for hip-hop. KRS-One would have a difficult time making it on the terrain these days, even I think of Kindred and some others. But the thing is, how then do we provide a counterweight? You see, and that's when, Sister Bree, Black Lives Matter, the only counterweight is love exemplified in courageous action. That's all black folk has ever had. You see, the memory, integrity, and spiritual tenacity. But we got now spiritual vacuity. Emptiness in leadership, emptiness in being successful, emptiness on being visible. Where's the real thing? Where's the substance? Where is the love that exemplified in courageous action that says, I got to do collectively as well as individually? You see. So in terms of this spiritual crisis, how would you all connect this rich conversation that you're doing to the spiritual crisis that all of us face, but especially our precious young folk?
I mean, Doc, what's been powerful to me about the moment is the level of spirituality that is at work that is unnamed. And the mere fact, particularly here in Ferguson, what they've been able to accomplish limited to no resources. Right. And those resources are not just simply about money. You know, there's all these fights that, you know, on Twitter and Facebook about money. Ain't no real money come to Ferguson. So I was in New Orleans 6 months after the storm. Real money came to New Orleans. This little money that we getting ain't no real money, so we fighting over crumbs. But I'm gonna tell you about the integrity of this movement. 3 days before Ferguson, October, the city fathers came to the movement. They said, look here, we'll put $150 million on the table if y'all call it off. Don't do it. Came to the movement, and the movement said, hell no. That's a level of spiritual integrity that these young people with limited to no resources looked the city fathers in the face and told them, we don't want your 150 million, we still gonna march. Right? Now Moore is organizing and saying, y'all need to drop $1 billion if you want us to go home. Right? Meaning that through their Unveil the Prophet, through the work that a lot of the folks are saying, is there's got to be $1 billion in resources, not in a town that in a town that got Danforth money and Monsanto. It's $1 billion around here, right? It's $1 billion. They can go get it. So they're saying, the movement is saying now there's $1 billion investment you can make in schools and dilapidated housing. We're gonna take you through here, Doc, all over the place. There's enough dilapidated housing in one neighborhood here to house every homeless person in this town. Right? But there's a level of spiritual integrity that these young folks were able to pull on with limited to no resources, particularly from the black church, particularly from the prophetic tradition. I think one way that we do it is in a very simple way. The only legitimacy that I have, and it's tenuous, right? They may turn up on me anytime, is because I spend time with them. They're in my home. We break bread. I make some mean kale. So I break bread with these young activists regularly, right? We eat together. And part of it is, I think, in terms of getting them access to the spiritual resources, has to do with the fact that they've been so beat up by society, been so hated. Like one of the, and so I don't care if they burn the whole town down. I ain't never saying a word against our babies. Never. Right? Now, when we get around my dinner table, I'm gonna have a few words with them. Right. They always complain about how grumpy I am, because I've been chasing after you all night. That's why I'm grumpy. But I'm saying that, so part of it is that what our children have not experienced, and particularly in the collapse of the global economy and the shredding of the social infrastructures and civil society, combined with the dominant theological project of the black church being the prosperity. It's always been there, but it's the dominant project now. So young people are beat up, pull up your pants, they get beat up so bad. Part of it is that what is our proximity to the suffering of young people, and what are our real relationships, right? And so for me, in terms of any time on TV, I'm gonna lift them up and I'm gonna celebrate them, right? So so part of it is that how do we defend them at all cost? And then the correction happens in private space. And so I don't care what they do. They can burn it down. Reverend Sekou, what do you think about the violence? Democracy's on fire. I ain't even talking about the buildings. Right, I'm going straight to the existential. Democracy's on fire. Well, what about the property destruction? How much property is Michael Brown's life worth? So how do we, and I'm saying that to the folks in the room, how do you defend our children, right? How are you present for them? What ways are you showing up? And then I'm not saying everybody got to be in the street, but at least one time you need to go get baptized. At least one time, right? There's one time when they pull them tanks and tear gas out. You go stand with them babies, right? And you say to the powers, if you to get them, you're gonna have to get through me. Right? That kind of and so in that kind of context and in that kind of relationship, that carves out a space where we can enter because the part of the gift of the black church, for me and Bree were talking about that the black church loved us. We know that's not everybody's experience. But part of the gift for me in the black church was that I knew that they loved me. I mattered. And so part of shifting the church to the street is that part of what we need to do as religious leaders is not be trying to show up and lead and all of that stuff, is to defend our children in the face of the powers, them seeing us do that consistently, and then they'll come to a place where they can trust us. But there is no reason that any young black person in this country should trust the black church. We ain't earned it. Not in modern history, we ain't earned it. But what they can do is that when we show up for them consistently, we love them, we defend them. And I want to say this about the queer thing. I know, right, a lot of, old folk don't get it, and I don't understand it. I just found out I was cisgendered last week. I don't get it. But I'm going to tell you this, to borrow from your line in the Matrix, right? Comprehension is not requisite for compassion. You don't have to understand it to defend our children, to love them, to make them feel valued, right? And so part of I think for me, the part of the spiritual depth and spiritual resources is being in proximity of the suffering of young folks, showing up for them in everyday ways, right? And at least in public space, always defend them, even when they attack us. So young people can come for me. They can call me all kinds of names, talk about me like a dog. But I ain't gonna never say a word against you. Because even when I disagree with you, you mine. And I'm gonna defend you with my very life. And I believe that is a way in which young people will be signaled that they might be serious. They might actually love us. This may not actually be about the camera for them. Right? And so I think that just consistently showing up, consistently being present, and offering a space and time whereby they can matter.
I'm going to invite you, if you've got questions, I know we want to respond here, to go ahead and line up because we're running clear to our time. We're not over our time, but we're running up on it. So if you got one burning, go ahead and get lined up.
Doc, you said it when you said courageous act of love. I'll bet, now I can't read Bree Newsom's mind, but I'll bet when she made the choice she made, it wasn't, I'm going to lose X, Y, or Z if I did, she did it. Do you know what it takes to be the 1%? What salary it takes? Now, I'm not talking about in the United States. Do you know how many of us in this room are 1%? Right. If you make $30,000 a year, you're in the 1% in this world. So what are our courageous acts of love where we do without worrying about what we're going to lose? That's the courageous act of love.
If I could just add one piece here, is that you talked about remembering the history, and also I think it's also about pulling forth something that is making something that is invisible visible. And I think that is the job of the artist. And most artists are activists, and most activists are artists. And so I actually think... There you go, right there. There you go. Hey. So, I think that, what I was struck by when I watched you, Bree, scale that pole, and I'm not sure if it was you or the person who was holding the camera, and the one that I saw, who was actually quoting the Lord's Prayer. It was you who was quoting the Lord's Prayer as you were going up I wept. Because as you went up that pole, quoting the Lord's Prayer, snatching down white dominion and taking it with you and going to jail for it, what you did was you made what was invisible visible. In the same way that now you're talking about a generation that has been, or not even just generation, but decades that have been without God, or forgotten how we have forgotten the power of the civil rights movement, right? What God did in that time, so we haven't believed. I think what you did, I think what you have been doing, I think what the young people, they have been artists. Because what you have been doing is making what is invisible visible. In the same way that Moses made the power of God visible with the plagues in Egypt. In the same way that when God went to Ezekiel and said, lay on your side and do a little like street theater for the people. Or when God said to, I think it was Jeremiah or somebody, go get some clay pots and throw them down on the stairs of the temple and say to the people, this is what you are doing to my people. Like, you are making what is invisible visible, and that is the power of it, because it's helping us to remember the truth. Yeah.
Ma'am, thank you.
To honor to God, who is the head of my life, I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing, everybody in this building. And you started out by asking, what were you doing the day that Mike Brown happened? Well, I have to just go back a little bit. When I was 7 years old, I was in church and the service was high, and the preacher who drove a cab during the week was saying, Jesus is the only begotten Son of the Almighty God. And as a 7-year-old, I'm listening to this and I'm like, well, if Jesus is the only begotten Son, well, why did he make me? So this whole idea about Black Lives Mattering, how when you start in the church, and see, I'm 60, so I came along when in the front page, Jesus was portrayed as this white person. And so the black preacher tells me that the only person that mattered to God was Jesus. But the Holy Ghost said to me, don't believe that. I'm 7 years old and God spoke, and I said, well, everybody else believes it. So I'm in a generation where I'm seeing white men sick to dogs and the hoses on the people in Alabama, but Jesus is a white man, and I'm supposed to trust that his best interests are for me. And so as a child growing up with this confusion and this tugging and this pulling, so then I fast forward, I attended Spelman College, and I participated in a training, Martin Luther King Nonviolent Social Training. So I'm 20, and I'm mad at white people by this time, very angry. So I'm in this group session, and this white guy was sitting there saying, the violence is in the education. And I'm like, no, it's white men and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He says, you don't understand, the violence is in the education. So we're a bunch of black people sitting around trying to learn these nonviolent techniques. And so then the blue eyes started tearing up. He started to cry silently. That got my attention. I'm like, a white man crying? And so then I thought, well, wasn't it violent that I was educated that Jesus was the only begotten Son and that he was a white man, but white people could sick dogs and hoses? So I had this going back in time. So I wanted to know where and when I entered, I went to Africa, okay? Because I'm like, the Egyptologist was saying that, you know, all the greatness came out of Africa. So when I get there, I'm waiting on the heavens to open up, and well, I was silent. I'm like, oh, this isn't it. So 6 months later, I end up in Ghana, and when the plane hit the tarmac, the tears ran. It was the souls of my ancestors, and I'll never forget this little three-legged dog running around, and I'm like, how did he survive? He's got 3 legs. So I'm with this group of people that were trying to give me the proper idea of what the power of the Bible was. And they're saying it's a spiritual technology manual, and that our word is powerful. So the morning that Mike Brown was shot and killed, I was doing my ritual where I was reading from Daniel 2:20, where he says, the things that are in darkness are gonna come into the light. And I invited all my ancestors to be present with me because the record is in our DNA. I'm my great, 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 great parents. And I had this revelation that the people that came over in the trip on the boat didn't know Jesus. And I said, who was their God? I wanted to know what God sustained them that they could survive and I could be present having sprang from their loins. So as I prayed Daniel 2:20, I called out their names and I raised my hands, because you know that is just, the power is in our hands. And then I went about my day, and then Michael Brown. And all I could think, I said, Lord, you heard me, but I didn't want it to come down like this. But what's in the darkness has to be brought into the light. He makes kings, he brings down kings. And so I just celebrate this conversation about women can preach, the violence in the education in the church is that women are supposed to be silent.
Say it.
Okay? And how you pointed out, the women, who was at the tomb? The women. And then this thing about Peter, they had to calm him down because how could a woman see Jesus before him? Because the church is based on his name. But I just want to encourage everybody to understand that we're God. We're made in his image and likeness. The violence is in the education about what they teach us about the most powerful spiritual technology known to man. And I just, again, encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. I'm doing my small part. I'm working on a project where we will be bringing in inmates into the area to revitalize all of North St. Louis City. The time is now. And I just want one more point I want to say.
Well, please, one more, because the time is now.
Okay, because I just wanted to say that we have to look at the time. So 50 years ago, Civil Rights Act, 150 years ago, 250 years ago, the founding of St. Louis, and now this is the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment. Okay, so we want to be conscious of the time is now. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Good deal. Thank you very much. So we have come upon the time that we committed to you, and we want to make transitions. And I know some of our conversation partners need to make transitions as well. So I want to offer to them some final moments of reflection that they would like to share, final comments that they'd like to share with those who are here gathered, with the recognition that we will have a part 2 of this conversation with some of these partners at 7:30 p.m. tonight. Shameless plug. In our conversation at Greater St. Mark. Okay. All right. They're okay. All right. Are there other burning questions? And again, we do ask that you ask a question. Okay.
Hi, I do have a question. It usually takes many decades to reach the access to faith-based institutional resources that can help people organize, for example, becoming a pastor in the church, gaining access to a venue and an audience, or becoming the head of, as Sekou mentioned, a faith-based nonprofit. So because there's this barrier of time to getting to these things, what are some concrete things that we can do to support youth-based faith leadership either inside or outside the church?
So, real quickly, little brother, just go to the street. Don't worry about the church. And I'm not being...
I'm going to disagree.
And what I mean by that is that, so there are internships and that kind of thing. But we're sitting in this room having this conversation because some poor black kids with no resources said, you're not going to leave our son in the street our brother in the street for 4.5 hours and not think we going to say nothing. Right? Church showed up late and wrong. And I don't know, I want to be clear about that. Showed up late and wrong. So I'm saying and there is a certain gift of, now you need to be organized. So that's different than an organization. That's different than a nonprofit complex, right? Industrial complex. But you do need to be organized. So I'm not forswearing don't be organized. But what I am saying is that what happened in Ferguson, the reason why it can move so quick and fast, all the new formations, MAL, Hands Up United, Tribe X, Black Soldiers, all those are new formations. Them ain't old organizations. And all the national organizations that pulled out, they the ones still here. Right? And so as young folks creating their own alternative spaces, not encumbered by board of directors, not encumbered by grant reports, not encumbered by funders, right? Taking to the street and engaging the work. Now, that's not to say there hadn't been foundation support, hadn't been to say there haven't been an older organizational infrastructure. More OBS has been primarily providing our infrastructure, right, for us in terms of jail support, getting resources. Don't Shoot Coalition is the major organizing body. It is the coalition of the primary liberal formations that do much of the policy negotiations for us, right? So I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying, but what moved this here, right, was a kid your age. How old are you, baby? Yeah, some 20-year-olds. I can't stand y'all. I'll be marching all night because of y'all. But do you understand what I'm saying? That that when you hit that, when y'all begin to self-organize, it pushes everybody else. It's like a domino. Young people hit the street, and then everybody else started moving. And so I'm gonna tell you what Ella told him in April 4th, 1960. Don't you join them. You start your own organization. And that became the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So do your work in your location, on your ground, on your campus. Find out the black folk they shooting in your neighborhood, and you go start organizing with them, right? And then y'all begin to build out your own base, your own organizing capacity, and then from there, other stuff is going to move. But I'm telling you, the church, they'll catch up eventually. They'll catch up eventually.
See, here's what I would say is I'd say absolutely every single thing you said is true until they'll catch up eventually, because they will not necessarily catch up eventually. They will not necessarily. You are being generous, but it takes organizing to do that. So it takes people who are actually focused on the church to catch the church up. So if you are actually focused on the church, there are things you can do. There are curricula that you can download from multiple websites. There's Surge. Sojourners has a racial justice guide. There's books that you can actually use. Race Matters, hello. There's other books you can use to do book studies in your church. And actually the most powerful tool I have seen work in multi-ethnic, must be multi-ethnic, does not work in all white settings. And doesn't really, you don't need it necessarily in all black settings or people color settings, is the talking circle or the healing circle. Talking circle is what comes from Native American tradition. Healing circle is the translation of that into Western culture, right? So, but what that is a circle where you sit and you literally spend your time listening to each other's stories. Because the piece that we found in our work on immigration reform within the evangelical world was that the two things that made evangelicals at the hub of what was stopping immigration reform from moving forward was that evangelical church become divorced from two things. One, the scripture. I'm really real. Like they literally have started in the 20th century, started filling in the blank, and they just completely have no idea of what scripture actually says about most things. And then two, divorced from each other, from people who are not like them. So the being immersed, baptized in the stories of the other is what is the power of the talking circle. So organizing talking circles in multi-ethnic settings is probably one of the most powerful things you could do. And then taking the people, giving people who are in those talking circles the opportunity to come and join the actions being planned by the young people who are leading the movement. You do not go out and start your own thing in STL when Moore and OBS are already doing it, right? You organize in your church and bring them into what they are already doing.
Good deal. Dr. Hunt, you have the final word.
Mr. President.
I just want to say that in the United Church of Christ, in denominations, there's lots of money.
Yes.
And what denominations need to do, and what the United Church of Christ is willing to do, is to keep supporting the old, the traditional, but also to resource the new. So I think you can find some of those resources that will sustain the work that you want to do. But I hate for the last word to just be a plug for the United Church of Christ.
Okay. There'll be a transitional word. It just won't be in the same manner. So, I agree. That's not a good place to. That's a place to put a comma, not a period.
Amen. Amen.
So that being said, we thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. We will now begin to transition in preparation for worship. And for those who have not been here before, it is a place where this dialogue is appropriate and has been since before the last 365 days. And so our worship reflects that as well. I want to ask, what we're going to do is have some transitional music. Actually, I want to ask, I was going to ask Bishop Selders, are you about to leave right now? All right, okay. You escaped one. I was about to ask you to lead us in a bit of musicality as we transition from this conversational space to worship. Thank you very much, Bishop Selders. We believe in freedom.